It begins, as most things did in the medieval world, with the tolling of a distant church bell, soft, low, and carried by the wind across open fields, cobbled lanes, and ivy-wrapped cloisters. The sound did not merely mark the hour. It called attention to something deeper, to the rhythm of life itself. Time, in the medieval world, was less about minutes and more about moments, of prayer, of work, of stillness. And beauty, too, was shaped by those same quiet forces. In this chapter, we drift not into palaces or portraits, but into the silent spaces where beauty was observed, measured, and yearned for. Beauty in medieval Europe was not an accident, nor a simple matter of personal taste. It was a spiritual pursuit, an aspiration that tied the soul to the body and the body to divine order. To be beautiful was not just to be pleasing to the eye, it was to reflect, however faintly, the perfection of heaven, and so, a woman might rise before dawn, wash her face with rainwater left overnight in a glazed earthen bowl, and say a prayer, not only for her health but for her appearance, for clear skin, soft hair, and a figure that would not draw shame. She might press her fingers to a rosary, her heart whispering hopes for a pale complexion, a high forehead, and eyes that seemed ever downcast. These, she had learned, were signs of virtue. Outside her narrow window, the world was harsh. There were muddy roads, shouting merchants, clanging iron. But within her small chamber, where the rushes on the floor were freshly changed, and a dried sprig of lavender hung near the hearth, there was a gentler dream. And that dream, shaped by sermons and song, by saints and sumptuary laws, told her what she ought to be. To understand medieval beauty is not to list traits like a catalogue. It is to understand longing for status, for purity, for survival. A young woman might bleach her hair with ash and lie, not out of vanity, but because golden locks suggested nobility, even if her family barely scraped by. A girl might pluck the front of her hairline until her brow stretched high and bare, not to follow a fad, but because it was believed that such a look revealed more of the soul, unclouded by earthly distraction. And for men, beauty was a different kind of burden. They were expected to be strong, yes, but also symmetrical. A nobleman's face was supposed to be a mirror of order, clear skin, a modest beard, perhaps, and a gaze that conveyed both command and calm. A bent nose or crooked teeth, though often unavoidable, could mark one as brutish, sinful, or simply unlucky. In portraits, they might appear serene, but beneath the oil paint was likely the same tension, a quiet fear that their face might betray their place. Yet few people would ever see their own reflection clearly. There were no mirrors as we know them, only polished metal, poor glass, or water. Most people relied on others to describe their appearance, and so beauty became communal. It was something spoken, whispered, judged aloud. A compliment from a priest or merchant might carry the weight of a blessing. A jest about someone's pale skin, or lack of it, might linger for months. It was not only women who suffered under these ideals. Men, too, were shaped by a rigid mold. And both genders carried the same unspoken truth. Beauty, or its absence, could determine one's fate. A pretty daughter might marry well. A handsome squire might catch a lord's favor. A face, fair or not, could open doors or seal them shut. But still, beauty was not just a weapon. It was also a comfort. In illuminated manuscripts, in stained glass, in the carved curve of a cathedral column, beauty was revered. It reminded people that there was more to life than toil, that even in a world of hunger and hardship, something soft and golden could still exist. As the sun rose higher over the thatched rooftops of a small village, the bell's echo faded. A girl leaned closer to her basin, turning her cheek to the window light. Somewhere, in a convent library, a monk copied a passage on virtuous appearance. And in the market square, a boy whistled a tune about a lady so fair that even roses bowed their heads. Beauty, in the medieval world, was both a gift and a curse. But more than that, it was a language. one written not in ink but in gaze and gesture and silence and sigh, and to begin to speak that language, we must listen gently. The standards were unyielding. They were whispered in prayers, painted into manuscripts, etched into memory by tales passed down through generations. And nowhere did they speak louder than in the traits most praised. Though one said to mark a woman as divine, pure, and untouched by sin. Skin was first, always the skin, pale, nearly translucent, the color of ivory, of unspoiled linen, of moonlight on snow. This was the highest beauty, not because it was rare, but because it symbolized virtue. Pale skin meant you did not work in the sun. Pale skin meant wealth. Pale skin meant purity. It was, in short, a holy shade. And so women labored to become paler still. They bled themselves, drank vinegar, or stayed inside for weeks. They powdered their faces with mixtures of crushed white lead and ground pearls, if they could afford it, or chalk and flour, if they could not. The result was often illness, fainting, even death. But a white face was worth the cost for it, made you visible in ways nothing else could. And then, the hair, golden hair, was not simply beautiful. It was sacred. Medieval poets wrote of women whose hair shimmered like wheat in sunlight, whose locks could tangle a man's soul. Blonde hair was considered angelic. Childlike, blessed, dark hair, though not reviled, carried more ambiguity. It could be mysterious or dangerous. Red hair was worse. Red meant passion, temptation, a sign of the devil in some tales. Many red-haired girls tried to lighten their strands, dousing them in ash or lying in the sun with herbs steeped in vinegar. It was common to pull hair back from the face entirely, not to display it, but to emphasize the forehead. A high forehead was noble. It suggested intelligence, restraint, holiness. And so women plucked their brows, their hairlines, sometimes halfway up their scalp. The pain was dismissed. It was the price of virtue. Eyebrows were thinned into delicate curves or removed altogether. Lashes were often lightened. Lips should be small, modest, and pale. Red lips were suggestive, too full of life. A pale lip, gently curved, whispered obedience. And yet beauty did not exist in a vacuum. It shifted by region, by century, by class. What one town praised another might mock, but some things remained: symmetry, softness, stillness. A beautiful woman was not expressive. She was a painting, composed, passive, waiting. In courtly love poetry, she was often distant, untouchable. A lady of high birth with a veil drawn just so, and neck long like a swan's, fingers pale and thin folded neatly in her lap. She did not laugh aloud. She did not sweat. She did not run. In real life, of course, things were different. Real women bore children, tended fires, washed clothes in freezing water. But they were measured still against these impossible ideals. A barmaid might envy a noble woman's pale complexion, while that noble woman longed for the barmaid's youth. Girls compared themselves in silence, their reflections dim and uneven. Mirrors were rare, but judgment was constant. And men were watching, judging, writing poems, singing songs, painting saints in the image of the girls they fancied. The church, too, had a say. Sermons warned women not to be vain, even as they outlined what modesty required. It was a paradox. Be beautiful, but pretend not to know it. Be graceful, but never aware. Be admired, but not desirous of admiration. And through it all, a quiet sadness seeped in. For who could ever fully meet the standard? The women who tried hardest were often those punished most. If you succeeded, you might be envied. If you failed, you might be forgotten. Beauty was a tightrope, and there was no net. In some convents, nuns wrote about the pressures, not in public, not aloud, but in the margins of prayer books and in small letters to sisters far away. They spoke of the burden of the body, of missing the days when girlhood was unmeasured, of dreams where they walked barefoot through fields without fear of judgment, because in truth everyone knew the game. The lady, the servant, the peasant girl, all were caught in it. Even the most devout could not escape it entirely. And so, every morning, the same ritual began again. The washing, the pinning of hair, the silent comparison, the prayers for beauty, not just to be seen, but to survive, because beauty was not only admired, it was demanded. It is easy to imagine beauty as something effortless, as the soft glow of candlelight on smooth skin, the way silk moves when one turns, the shimmer of hair braided with care. But beneath these images lies a truth rarely spoken of in songs or stories, that to be beautiful in the medieval world often meant to suffer. The suffering began early. A young girl, perhaps 7 or 8, might already hear whispered comments about her figure, her hair, her posture. Mothers corrected the way she walked, how she sat, whether her hands were folded neatly enough. Don't slouch. Keep your chin up. Don't let your skin brown. The world was watching always. And a girl's worth was being weighed before she even understood the rules, and so she learned them quietly. She learned that beauty was not only in the face, but in how one moved. Gracefulness was taught like a language, in the turn of the wrist, the tilt of the head. Laughter must be soft, modest, and restrained. A loud girl was a coarse girl, a girl who ran, who sweated, who climbed trees or kicked her feet too high. She was laughed at, or worse, ignored. As she grew, the pressure grew with her. Coarsery, even in early forms, began its reign, though not the steel-boned cages of later centuries. Medieval women still wore lacing and binding garments meant to shape the body into ideals: narrow waist, small bust, lifted posture. Layers of linen, wool, or silk were wrapped, pinned, and tightened. In summer, it caused fainting. In winter, it soaked up cold like a sponge, but always it constrained. Shoes, too, were chosen for form, not function. Pointed toes became fashionable. Among the wealthy, shoes that looked elegant but made walking painful. Some were so long they had to be tied to the leg with ribbons to keep from tripping. Heels were unknown, but hobbling was not. Beauty did not ask if you were comfortable, only if you were pleasing. And hair, all the hours spent on hair, was braided, coiled, covered, hidden. For unmarried girls, long loose hair was a symbol of purity, but it had to be washed, combed, treated with rosemary or lye. For married women, hair was to be veiled, modest, a signal of obedience. A lady might spend an hour dressing before she saw a soul, just to appear effortlessly composed. And for those with wealth, jewels, pins, and perfume turned beauty into burden. But not all women were noble. For the peasant girl, there were fewer layers, but no less pressure. She may not have worn lace or gold, but her cheeks were still expected to be rosy, her teeth white, her hair smooth, and she knew deeply that if she were deemed beautiful by the right man, a merchant, a reeve, a knight, her life might change. A better match, a gentler master, a path perhaps away from endless toil. So she did what she could. She washed in cold streams, rubbed crushed herbs on her cheeks for color, braided her hair with bits of ribbon. Her hands were rough, but she softened them with lard. Her skin was darkened by the sun, but she covered herself when she could. Beauty, even here, was survival. There were darker paths, too. Some women turned to charms, to ointments sold by wandering peddlers who claimed to have secret recipes from Moorish lands or nunneries hidden in the hills. Powders to lighten the skin, tinctures to make eyes brighter. Some were harmless, others burned, and still they were used, because beauty was not only about admiration. It was currency. It was armor. It was hope. In songs, a woman might be praised for her golden hair and her silent gaze. But the real woman, the one standing barefoot in a stone room, pinning back her curls while frost crept in through the shutters, she was enduring. And yet she did not speak of the pain. Not aloud. To do so would be unbecoming. So she smiled. She curtsied. She lifted her chin even when her bones ached, because if the world believed she was beautiful, perhaps it would listen. Perhaps, just perhaps, it would be kind. To truly understand the cruelty of medieval beauty, one must look beneath the surface, not just at the garments or posture, but at the face itself, and what was done to it in pursuit of perfection. In the quiet corners of castle bedchambers, and the hidden spaces behind peasant cottages, women leaned into cracked mirrors and polished metal, chasing an illusion. The ideal face was pale, not just light, not healthy with sun-kissed glow, but ghostly and blemished, and touched by the labor or light of day. Pale skin was not merely a preference, it was a social marker. It spoke of wealth, of a life lived indoors, of delicacy and refinement. And so, for many women, the pursuit of whiteness began with powders. Ground chalk, lead, crushed pearls, even flour. These were brushed over the face in thin, dusty layers. The effect was a mask, softening the skin's natural texture, dulling redness, and covering freckles or marks. Some concoctions were harmless, temporary, a touch of flour, a dab of powdered lily root, but others sank into the skin and stayed. Lead-based powders were common among the wealthy, imported and costly, sometimes laced with vinegar or oils. They created a flawless appearance for a while. But over time, they burned, they aged, they poisoned, lips cracked, teeth loosened, skin broke open in weeping sores. And still, the powders were applied again and again, because to go without them, to be seen with the flush of sun or the blemish of age, was worse. Eyebrows were another battlefield. In some periods, thin brows were desired, in others, no brows at all. Women plucked them with thread or knife, scraped them smooth, or covered them in paste to hide them beneath a layer of white. A high forehead was considered a sign of intelligence and nobility. To achieve it, some women plucked the hairline, pulling out the top rows of hair to give the illusion of a taller brow. The pain was quiet, constant, expected. Rouge, the touch of color to the cheeks or lips, was more controversial. Church leaders denounced it. To paint oneself was vanity, pride, deception. But it was used anyway. A touch of crushed berries, a dab of beetroot, a stain made from cochineal or wine sediment. The color had to be faint, barely there to look like health, not artifice. Too much, and a woman was mocked. Too little, and she was plain. Even teeth were not spared. Clean, white teeth were prized, but toothpaste was unknown. Instead, women chewed herbs, rubbed sage on the enamel, or rinsed with wine or vinegar. Some used mixtures of salt and ash, and breath. Breath was masked with cloves, mint leaves, or bits of perfumed wax held beneath the tongue. These were not luxuries, they were necessities, because beauty was not just what one saw, it was what one smelled, what one tasted, what one endured. And always, always, the church watched. Clergy railed against vanity. Sermons condemned women who painted their faces or adorned themselves too brightly. Beauty, they said, was a temptation, a snare. It led to sin, to downfall, to damnation. And yet, even queens wore rouge. Even nuns combed their hair, because the expectation of beauty was not erased by guilt. It was made heavier by it. In marketplaces, women traded recipes for skin creams and hair tonics in whispers. In noble halls, ladies waited for the right light to enter before stepping into view. In every corner of the medieval world, beauty was being built, one layer of powder, one plucked hair, one hidden bruise at a time. But beneath it all, the truth remained. The most impossible standard was not how one looked, but how one was expected to suffer for it silently, gracefully, and without question. And so they did. Hair, that silent crown upon the head, carried an astonishing weight in the medieval world. It was not merely a matter of style, nor even just beauty. It was identity, status, modesty, and sin woven together in strands. For women, hair was sacred and scandalous. Thick, golden hair was the ideal. Fair-haired maidens filled tapestries and illuminated manuscripts, their locks flowing like sunlight, symbols of purity and divine favor. Blonde hair, especially, was prized beyond measure, even if naturally rare. And so women went to extraordinary lengths to chase it. Herbal concoctions made from saffron, ash, and alum were rubbed into the scalp in hopes of lightening dark strands. Some rinsed their hair with lye or vinegar mixed with crushed marigold petals, then sat for hours in the sun, their heads wrapped in cloth and hope. These methods stung the skin, stripped the scalp, and often led to breakage, but the shimmer of pale hair, even briefly, was worth the pain. Curls were beloved, but not those wild and free by nature. No ideal curls were sculpted, delicate, arranged with care. Women twisted wet hair around rods or rags overnight to create waves. Wealthier ladies used heated irons or wrapped strands around hot metal pins, careful not to burn themselves. Hair was bound in nets, braided with ribbons, tucked under silk veils. It had to look effortless, though it was anything but. Yet once married, a woman's hair became something to be hidden. Letting it flow freely was no longer appropriate, unless one was alone or behind closed doors. In public, hair was veiled, coiled, or entirely covered. For the devout, bare hair was vanity. For the modest, it was a modesty. And for men, it was temptation. Because if a woman's hair was too beautiful, too exposed, too uncontrolled, she was blamed for the thoughts she stirred. Preachers warned of Eve's locks as snares for righteous men. A widow who let her hair down might be called lustful. A young girl whose hair fell loose might be seen as wild, careless, or worse. But the cruelty wasn't only toward women. Men, too, were subject to the tyranny of hair. Nobles kept their locks neatly trimmed or grown long in accordance with fashion, often slicked with animal fats or scented oils. Beards came and went with the reigns of kings, sometimes favored, sometimes shaved. Monks bore the tonsure, a bald circle atop the head, symbolic of humility, but not all chose it freely. For some, the shaving of hair was punishment, marking criminals, traitors, or disgraced clergy. And then there were the hidden judgments. A man with thinning hair might be mocked. A woman with coarse or dark hair might be called a servant, even if she was not. Those with lice, a common problem, were quietly shamed, even though few were spared. The expectations were clear, but the means to achieve them were not always available. Poorer folk did what they could, washing with cold water, combing with carved bone, rubbing rosemary or mint into their scalp. They made do, but they noticed, they envied, they judged. Because beauty was not about truth, it was about effort, about what you were willing to suffer to meet a vision drawn by others. And in all things, hair told a story, of age, of class, of virtue or vanity. It was worn proudly, hidden dutifully, altered painfully. It was not just a part of you, was a test. In the world of medieval beauty, nothing signified elegance and status more unmistakably than pale, almost translucent skin. The paler you were, the more powerful you seemed, not because of beauty alone, but because of what that pallor implied, that you did not labor, you did not toil, and you certainly did not stand beneath the sun. To be pale was to be wealthy. And so, for centuries, men and women of the upper classes chased that ghostly complexion with determination bordering on obsession. It began with avoidance. Parasols were not yet common in Europe, but wine-brimmed hats and heavy veils did the job. Nobles stayed indoors during daylight hours, especially in summer, keeping to shaded courtyards and candlelit halls. The sun was not a source of joy, it was an enemy to be evaded. A tan, after all, was the mark of the peasantry, of those who bent over fields and gardens, whose skin bore the kiss of labor. Then came the powders. Crushed white lead, deadly though it was drowned and mixed into pastes that could be spread across the face. It concealed freckles and sunspots, smoothed an even color, and created the illusion of purity. But it also poisoned the skin, creating sores that required yet more powder to cover. In time, it sickened the wearer, leading to fatigue, headaches, and worse. But it was fashionable, and fashion, as always, came before health. Other concoctions used ground chalk or flour, egg whites to tighten the face, vinegar to tone it. Women, And some men would paint their skin in layers, gently dabbing to avoid cracking. Some even pricked themselves to bleed a little, just enough to show a ghost of color on their cheeks, a contrast to the stark whiteness of their skin. And of course, there were the dangerous remedies, mercury, arsenic, and the lum, all found there, way into cosmetic recipes, promising brightness, radiance, even immortality. They delivered instead fatigue and decline, but by the time the consequences showed, the damage was already done. Freckles were despised, spots were feared, wrinkles were concealed, and yet the standards were built on contradiction. To appear youthful, one had to powder the face white, but to white, and you looked ill. To glow with health, the touch of rouge. But as always, these trends were whispers from above. The average woman had no access to such luxury or danger. Her face was flushed from wind, brown from the fields. The sun marked her. The cold cracked her lips. She could not afford poison. Disguised as paint, her beauty was not curated, but earned. In contrast, noble women, and sometimes men, painted themselves into portraits of stillness. Their beauty was performative, composed for banquets, councils, and portraits. It was a costume, but one that clung to the skin long after the party ended. Of course, church leaders condemned cosmetics, calling them vanity, deceit, a sin against the natural body God had given. Some preachers said to paint the face was to invite demons to admire it. Others warned that women who wore too much powder would be recognized by the devil before their own husbands. But those warnings rarely held sway against the pull of fashion, or fear of being judged less beautiful than one's rivals. And so, the mirror became a battleground. Each morning, the brush and the pot returned, powder on the cheeks, wax on the brows, lead on the skin, a mask of mortality, in pursuit of perfection. In the quiet halls of the manor, where tapestries muffled footsteps, and the scent of lavender hung faintly in the air, women prepared themselves before mirrors of polished metal, not to enhance what they had, but often to remove it. For in medieval beauty, absence was virtue, and nowhere was this more cruelly clear than in the pursuit of a hairless face. To be beautiful, a noble woman was not simply expected to possess fair skin, she was expected to have no eyebrows, number, lashes, and above all, a high, smooth forehead. A domed brow, vast and pale, was the height of courtly elegance. The ideal woman appeared as though she were glowing from within, her features receding, delicate, ethereal. And so the hairs that framed the face were plucked, sometimes painfully, strand by strand. Others resorted to more aggressive methods, singeing with heated tongs, scraping with rough stones, or applying concoctions meant to burn the hair. At the root, among the most popular depilatory pastes was a blend of vinegar, quicklime, and arsenic. Applied to the brow or temple, it promised smoothness, but often left scarring or blisters. Still, the ideal was stronger than the pain. Eyebrows, if present at all, were fade lines, often drawn on thinly with ash or charcoal. Eyelashes were considered vulgar or animalistic. Women rubbed at them with cloths, plucked them out, even scalded them off. The more ghost-like the eyes, the more refined the soul, or so the logic claimed. This desire for erasure stretched to the hairline. A woman might pluck away not just her brows, but the very front of her scalp, pushing back her hairline to create the illusion of a more towering forehead. The process was grueling, reddened skin, ingrown hairs, constant tenderness. But the result, a vast, pale brow, was praised in poetry, praised in paintings, praised in court. Even the style of the hair that remained was a trial. Long hair was a symbol of virtue and fertility, but it had to be carefully braided, coiled, or hidden beneath elaborate veils, hoods or cauls, delicate mesh taps of silk or gold thread. Hair should never be worn loose in public by a married woman. That was the mark of sin, madness, or worse. Washing the hair was itself a complicated affair. Soap was harsh and rare. Instead, women used mixtures of rosemary water, eggs, and crushed herbs, or even rinsed their hair with lye to remove oil, though this could strip the scalp raw. Combs were made of bone or boxwood, and lice were an unfortunate reality, combed through daily in hushed rituals before the hearth. For peasant women, there was little time for such vanity. A scarf or wimple sufficed, tied tight for work and weather. But even among them, tidiness was a virtue. Unkempt hair, especially uncovered, might be seen as a sign of laziness, or worse, witchcraft. And yet the standard persisted. From castle to cottage, from court to convent, women were shaped by expectations that demanded they not only beautify, but disappear. The less of the woman you could see, the smoother her skin. The barer her face, the paler her expression, the more she was prized. It was a beauty built on subtraction. And beneath the veils and powders, beneath the scraped brows and blistered hairlines, lay something else, a silent endurance, a strength not found in war or armor, but in daily ritual, in the choice to rise each morning, to face the mirror, and to bear the impossible ideal. Yet again, imagine, if you will, a face that glows without warmth, pale as linen, smooth as plaster. This, in the world of the medieval noblewoman, was not the result of health, but of ambition. A pale complexion, near white, and touched by sun or soil, was not merely a symbol of wealth. It was a badge of virtue, refinement, and untouchability. And to achieve it, women subjected their skin to poisons disguised as powders. Secrets passed from chamber to chamber like alchemy. The obsession with whiteness began, perhaps, with the notion that the more distant one was from manual labor, the better. The lower classes toiled under open skies, the elite stayed inside, shaded by stone and cloth. Thus paleness became a marker, not just of status, but of supposed moral purity. And so began a quiet war against the body's natural tones. Among the most coveted cosmetic ingredients of the time was Venetian truce, a white lead-based paste imported at great expense, made from vinegar and lead left to corrode and then ground into powder. It covered blemishes, created an even tone, and lent a ghostly smoothness. But it did so at a cost. Lead seeped into the skin, slowly poisoning the wearer. Symptoms included hair loss, blackened teeth, skin erosion, and eventually organ failure. And yet, it remained in use for centuries. The application was a ritual. After cleansing the skin, often with rose water, vinegar, or alcohol, the truce was applied with a soft cloth, layer upon layer, until the skin no longer resembled flesh but porcelain. Over this, powders of ground pearls, rice, or crushed bone might be dusted. Some women used egg whites to tighten the skin, cracking into a sheen when they smiled. Freckles, moles, and sunspots were considered imperfections, signs of vulgarity or sin. These were concealed or removed through harsh means: lemon juice, bleaches, burnt shells, even crushed insects. Some women turned to more was needed, but too much, and you were vulgar. The line between noble and scandalous was razor thin. Men, too, were judged. A knight with tanned skin might be seen as brutish, less refined than his powdered peers. A merchant whose face grew ruddy from drink or sun would cover it with paste before attending court. Even priests were not immune, for though vanity was a sin, appearances still mattered in ecclesiastical circles. And beneath all this, there was another unspoken truth. The ideal of beauty was not just about skin. It was about control, about denying the natural, the sun, the labor, the passage of time, and presenting instead a carefully crafted illusion, one that required wealth, servants' time, and pain. To be beautiful in this world was to suffer quietly, to wear discomfort like a second skin and pretend it was effortless. It was a performance played out in candlelit chambers and cold stone mirrors, where each morning meant renewal and each blemish a tiny failure. This was not merely a look, it was a discipline. In the medieval mirror, if such a luxury was even owned, the eye was drawn not to the smile or the gaze, but to the vast canvas of the forehead. For centuries, The noble forehead was the centerpiece of beauty, revered and exaggerated to unnatural proportions. The wider and higher it appeared, the more refined the face beneath it was believed to be, and so, across Europe, women plucked not just their eyebrows, but their hairlines. This was no casual grooming, this was a ritual. Each morning, with a steady hand and a sense of duty, noble women would pluck away the fine baby hairs along their brows and temples, creeping their hairline backward millimeter by millimeter. Week after week, a domed, glistening forehead, smooth and bare, was the goal, one that made the skull appear elongated, the mind within vast and cultivated. The ideal was not entirely invented in Europe. It mirrored ancient Roman tastes and even echoed Byzantine icons where the divine often wore untroubled, rounded foreheads, unsullied by hair or shadow. But in medieval fashion, it became an obsession. Eyebrows were stripped to fine lines or removed altogether. Plucking was done with tweezers of bone or metal, or by rubbing pumice stone along the skin. Some women used bandages soaked in vinegar to irritate and thin the hair. Others burned it away carefully with a candle's flame. Pain, of course, was expected, even welcomed, as part of the beauty process to further enhance the look. The remaining brows were sometimes penciled in with soot or colored wax, but even that was risky, too dark, and one looked suspicious, too fine, and it vanished entirely under candlelight. As always, there was a fine line between elegance and excess. Portraits of the time tell the story plainly. Women with serene, moon-like faces, their foreheads rising like the sky above their features, their eyes soft and low on the face, their hair pulled tightly back beneath veils, nets, or jeweled circlets. It is an alien standard to modern eyes, but to them it was the peak of grace. And as with all beauty standards, it was a mark of privilege. A peasant woman could not afford to spend hours plucking and painting. She did not have the leisure to nurse irritated skin or rework her brow before vespers. The plucked forehead became another visual symbol of status, a way of saying, "I do not labor, I perfect." For men, the brows remained more natural, though they too were sometimes shaped for nobility or cleanliness. But women bore the burden of transformation. A natural hairline was a rural one. A neat, receding one marked the lady of culture. And beyond the physical pain, there was the social vigilance. A woman who failed to maintain her forehead might be whispered about. Is she well? Has she fallen in fortune? A single unruly brow could spark speculation about health, wealth, even morality. So, the mourning ritual endured, the plucking, the shaving, the smoothing of balm, all for the sake of a forehead that would never be touched, never kissed, never wrinkled in public view, only admired from a distance. It was a quiet battle, not with age or blemish, but with the very nature of the face itself. To glimpse medieval woman at court, bathed in candlelight or seated by the hearth, was not to see her natural skin, but a creation, a canvas, a face reshaped not by nature, but by pigment powder, and sometimes poisoned. Pale skin was the pinnacle, not just fair, but ghostly marble, ethereal. To be pale was to be untouched by the sun, a clear sign that you did not toil outdoors, did not sweat in fields, did not labor in gardens or markets. Pale skin meant nobility, fragility, purity, but nature rarely cooperates with ideals. And so women turned to cosmetics to correct what the sun or time had stained. One of the most common and most dangerous tools in the medieval beauty arsenal was white lead. Crushed and powdered, it was mixed with vinegar or oil to create a creamy paste. This truth could be spread across the face, neck, and even the chest to produce an unbroken field of porcelain skin. The effect was stunning by candlelight, where shadows danced and imperfections blurred. But under that surface, the lead seeped into pores. It poisoned slowly, caused tremors, thinned hair, blackened teeth. Still, the pursuit continued. In addition to lead, women used powders made from ground alabaster, chalk, or even crushed lily petals. Beeswax was used to smooth the skin. Rosewater or vinegar cleanses followed the mask of makeup, though few cleansers could remove what the lead had begun, and color had its place too, though it had to be subtle. A touch of red on the lips, perhaps from crushed berries or wine sediment, a faint blush on the cheeks, pinched into place or applied with cinnabar, another toxic mineral. Red ochre from clay work too, but too much, and the look was vulgar. A good lady's makeup should not look like makeup, for the eyes kohl and soot darkened the lashes and lids, a technique borrowed from older traditions stretching back to Egypt and the Middle East. In some courts, a small touch of blue or green around the eyes became fashionable, made from ground copper or lapis, rare and expensive. Superstitious methods, including prayers to saints known for purity or bathing under moonlight in silence, but even natural light was seen as a danger. Women avoided the sun, draping themselves in veils and hats, or sitting only in shaded gardens. Paradoxically, some even carried mirrors to reflect the light away from their faces. Windows were covered with cloth or parchment to soften the glare. Yet it wasn't only noble women who aspired to the pale ideal. Merchants' daughters, aspiring courtiers, even actors and musicians mimicked the look, sometimes with disastrous results. The cheaper versions of whitening pastes were even more caustic, using lime, chalk, or flour mixed with urine or lye. There is a quiet irony here. In chasing beauty, many disfigured themselves. In seeking admiration, they courted decay, and still the standard held fast, reinforced in illuminated manuscripts, in poetry and portraits. A pale woman was a canvas onto which society painted its desires. She was not real, and perhaps that was the point. And beneath it all, a burning truth, as clear as a sunbeam through stained glass, that beauty in this world was not a gift. It was a sacrifice. There is hunger in history, not always for bread, but often for beauty, and in the candlelit courts and stone-walled halls of medieval Europe, thinness became not just a look but a longing, a body made smaller, lighter, quieter, a frame that seemed almost to vanish into shadow. Among noble women, this wasn't a matter of fashion alone. It was a symbol of disciplined piety, and at times, divine devotion. The ideal woman was delicate, slender arms folded in silence, narrow shoulders wrapped in linen, a stomach so flat it suggested modesty, temperance, and noble restraint. Plumpness, once a sign of prosperity in other times and cultures, was increasingly seen by the upper classes as vulgar. The softness of laborers, the roundness of those too attached to food or flesh. And so women learned to disappear. Fasting was cloaked in virtue. Religious women, nuns and pious laywomen, often refrained from eating, not just as an act of faith, but as a kind of spiritual perfection. Saints like Catherine of Siena became infamous for their extreme fasting, surviving on little more than water and communion wafers. These tales were admired, even emulated. And while most noble women did not take it so far, the idea that eating little made one closer to God and more beautiful sank deep into culture. It was not unusual for young women to eat separately from men. A small portion, pecked at gently, bread torn into pieces but not consumed, fruits arranged on a plate but barely touched. Appearances mattered. To eat heartily was to be mocked. A woman who ate with appetite was suspect, uncultured, unruly, perhaps even immoral. The corsetry and tightly laced bodices of the later medieval period only reinforced this shrinking. Fabric was pulled across ribs and waists, not for support, but for shape. The more tightly one was bound, the more desirable the figure, even if it made breathing difficult or caused fainting. Some girls began waist training in childhood. Their bones molded as they grew. A flat stomach was not just fashionable, it was enforced. And then came herbs, mint, vinegar, wormwood, parsley. These were whispered about in private. Herbs to suppress appetite, to ease digestion, to purge Some women drank vinegar before meals or chewed bitter greens between courses, not for taste but for control. Others found ways to vomit discreetly, blaming it on delicate humors or the heat. There is pain woven into the seams of their gowns, pain that rarely appears in portraits or poetry, for behind every slender lady serenaded in song was often a girl who counted berries, who trembled at bread, who measured beauty in what she denied herself. And yet, despite the ache, the dizziness, the hollowness, they were praised by men, by mothers, by the mirror. They were told they were becoming something sacred, something higher, something worth longing for. But at what cost? Because the truth is, bones are not made to bend so easily, and no body should be punished just to fit an idea drawn in ink centuries before. In the medieval world, beauty was never just about what was shown. It was equally about what was hidden. A woman's allure lay not in exposure but in the suggestion of what remained unseen, and so, layer by layer, fabric became both a shield and a symbol of purity, modesty, and submission. The veil was not merely a piece of cloth. It was a statement. For young maidens, a sheer linen veil might float behind them like a whisper, signaling innocence and virginity. For married women, thicker materials, wool or heavy silk, concealed hair entirely, turning the head into a private space, protected from wandering eyes. And for widows or those in religious life, the veil became more than modesty. It became mourning, devotion, silence made visible. To show one's hair was, in many circles, akin to showing one's skin. Unbound hair was wild, sensual, even dangerous. In art, you'll often see Mary Magdalene with her long hair cascading, a mark of repentance and raw emotion. But for everyday women, especially those of high status, loose hair was almost scandalous. Hair was braided, bound, coiled into nets, and tucked under caps, all to preserve the image of restraint. Even the face was managed. Eyebrows were thinned or plucked entirely. The space between the brow and the hairline was exaggerated. Some women even removed hair from the forehead to create the illusion of a higher, more noble brow. A wide, smooth forehead was considered the pinnacle of aristocratic grace. It made a woman look serene, thoughtful, and distant, as if always engaged in quiet contemplation. Hands were gloved or tucked inside sleeves. Ankles never flashed beneath hemlines. Necklines could vary, from tight and high among the devout, to square and open among the worldly. But even those that revealed skin were balanced by layers elsewhere. It was a game of balance, of hinting without offering. Jewelry, too, was carefully chosen. A circlet on the brow, a brooch at the collarbone, not to dazzle, but to elevate. Pearls were prized for their purity. Garnets and rubies hinted at passion, but only in the safe language of symbolism. Every adornment was part of the story a woman told without words, and behind every piece of fabric, behind every tucked curl and smooth brow, was the same message: control. Control of the body, control of desire, control of perception. Because beauty, in the medieval world, was rarely of freedom. It was a script, carefully written, tightly directed, and watched by many eyes. And though veils fluttered softly in the breeze, their weight, both literal and symbolic, was heavy. Before glass mirrors were common, before cosmetics came in tidy jars or could be bought at a market stall, medieval women still stood before their polished brass or silver reflections and asked the ancient question, "Am I beautiful enough?" The answers were shaped by tools, both humble and strange. Imagine a woman in her candlelit chamber, grinding almonds into a paste to soften her skin, or mixing crushed pearls with rose water to brighten her complexion. Pale skin was not just a preference. It was a declaration. It meant you did not labor in fields. It meant you were protected, pampered, and touched by sun and hardship. A pale face was a face of privilege. To maintain that ghostly whiteness, some women used a lead-based white paint, deadly over time, but dazzling in its effect. Others applied a chalky mixture made from vinegar and powdered bone to add a flush, They pinched their cheeks or dabbed on red plant dyes. Lips were tinted with crushed berries, or with cinnabar when one could afford the danger. Eyebrows, when not plucked into oblivion, were darkened with soot or coal. Teeth were scrubbed with salt or mint, and breath, so crucial in close quarters, was masked with clove or sage, chewed slowly like secrets held beneath the tongue. But the rituals weren't just for vanity. They were for survival in a world where a woman's appearance could change her fate. A marriage proposal, an alliance, even simple respect in a village square, all could hinge on whether you seemed pleasing enough to look at. And still, there was contradiction. To look too polished was to risk accusations of vanity or witchcraft. To appear too plain was to be overlooked entirely. Women walked a thin line caught between admiration and suspicion, between ornament and offense. Mirrors, when they existed, did not lie, but they didn't forgive either. What they showed was often less than kind, their distorted surfaces, warping both nose and self-esteem. Yet still, women looked. They smoothed their brows, they painted their lips, they adjusted their hoods, and hoped they had done enough not to feel beautiful, but to appear properly so. This chapter in beauty was not about joy. It was about safety, about control, about playing the game as best one could with herbs and ashes, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, it would be enough. In medieval Europe, beauty was not simply admired, it was traded, it was currency. A young woman's face, her bearing, the smoothness of her hands or the shade of her hair, might carry as much value as a chest full of coin. And, in a world built on alliances and inheritance, her appearance could determine not just her future, but the fate of her entire family. The concept of the dowry, the goods, land, or money a bride brought into marriage, is well known. But, alongside the dowry was something unspoken, the expectation of beauty. It was not enough to be fertile or obedient. A noble daughter had to present herself as desirable in the eyes of both suitor and society. Her value wasn't just measured in silver or acreage. It was measured in skin, in posture, in the length and gloss of her hair. Before matches were made, suitors might hear whispered assessments. She has a fine complexion, and her eyes are bright. Or, less favorably, her chin is weak. She will not bear strong sons. A woman's body was scrutinized like livestock, appraised for strength and purity. Her smile could sway a negotiation. A crooked tooth might delay a union. Fathers paraded their daughters at festivals and feasts, dressed in their finest gowns, jeweled girdles cinched tight. Mothers instructed them on how to tilt their heads just so, how to lower their gaze with practiced humility, how to speak softly and let their beauty do the work. It was a performance, learned early, refined over years, and critical to success. And for those not born noble, the stakes were no less high. A milkmaid with rosy cheeks might attract a merchant. A weaver's daughter with a graceful walk could catch the eye of a town scribe. Beauty offered the illusion of upward mobility, but it came with risks. A pretty face could mean unwanted attention, suspicion of sorcery, or the jealousy of other women. In some places, a beautiful woman alone on the road might be seen not as vulnerable, but as bait. Marriage was supposed to offer protection, but it also sealed one's role, one's station. Beauty, once traded, became someone else's possession. In paintings of the time, brides are shown demure and polished, but never powerful. Their beauty is framed by the presence of fathers, priests, or grooms. It is not theirs to wield, is theirs to offer. Even love, if it came at all, was a secondary concern. Marriages were contracts, dowries were bargaining chips, and beauty was the ribbon on the parchment. Decorative, necessary, never quite free. So the young girls practiced. They smiled when told, they cried in secret when the match was made, and they hoped that the man who bought their beauty would, at the very least, be kind. In medieval society, no attribute was more exalted or more cruelly weaponized than a woman's virginity. It was idealized in poetry, venerated by the church and demanded by noble households. But behind this reverence lay something far less romantic: surveillance, suspicion, and immense social pressure. To be beautiful and unwed was to be watched. Every word, every glance, every step outside the home could be scrutinized. A woman's reputation, so fragile and so vital, could be shattered by the whisper of a rumor. Virginity was not only a virtue, it was an economic and social asset. For noble daughters, it was essential to marriage negotiations. A woman rumored to have been defiled, whether true or not, could find herself cast out of inheritance, barred from favorable unions, or even forced into the cloister. And it was not just chastity that was demanded, but the appearance of chastity: modest dress, downcast eyes, silence in the presence of men. Purity was a performance. To safeguard this asset, some families went to extreme lengths. Girls were confined to towers, accompanied everywhere by chaperones, or even locked away during times of festivity. In some courts, young women were kept in households with older married ladies, a kind of moral quarantine meant to preserve their innocence. These arrangements were rarely about safety. They were about control. And what of the girl herself? Her body was not her own. It was a symbol, a prize, a testament to her father's honor and her mother's diligence. Medical beliefs of the time, often laughable by today's standards, asserted that virginity could be physically proven, that a hymen or the flush of the cheeks was evidence enough. Some men even demanded tokens of proof on the wedding night, and if none could be provided, scandal followed. The church encouraged this obsession. Virginity was likened to sainthood, and many of the most revered female saints were venerated precisely for their refusal to marry or their death in defense of their chastity. Stories of women leaping into rivers, throwing themselves from cliffs, or facing torture rather than be touched filled the pages of hagiographies. These were held up as models of feminine virtue. For women, the standard was unattainable. They were expected to be beautiful, yet modest, desirable, yet untouched, educated enough to manage a household, yet not so learned as to challenge a man. The line was razor thin, and the consequences of slipping were immense. In some places, tests of virginity were carried out with humiliating rituals. Midwives might be called to examine a girl prior to marriage, or the village priest might be asked to vouch for her purity based on years of observation. Even among peasants, a woman's reputation could be a matter of survival. A farmer's daughter known to be loose might never marry, regardless of her skill or virtue otherwise. Meanwhile, men were given far more leeway. A nobleman's dalliances were rarely punished. A squire's indiscretions could be laughed off. The double standard was so deeply rooted that it was rarely questioned. And yet, women bore the burden, quietly, endlessly, painfully. To exist as a young woman in this world was to live in tension, between expectation and autonomy, between sacred and shameful, between idealized womanhood and the impossible task of achieving it. And even for those who succeeded, who remained untouched and blemished and beautiful, the reward was often little more than a marriage contract and a lifetime of further demands. In medieval Europe, the ideal of beauty was not shaped by sun and sweat, but by shadows and stillness. The most prized trait in a woman's appearance, above even golden hair or delicate features, was her skin, pale, unmarked, almost translucent. But this preference was not simply aesthetic. It was deeply tied to status, morality, and even perceived virtue. Fair skin in the eyes of medieval society meant that a woman was untouched by labor. It meant she did not toil in fields, did not carry water, did not scrub hearthstones or bake bread. A pale face was the mark of wealth, of a life lived indoors, behind curtains and stone walls, protected from the sun. To be fair was not just to be lovely, it was to be better. This association created an impossible pressure for women of all classes. For noble women, It became a lifelong task to maintain the illusion of untouched skin. They avoided sunlight with veils, parasols, and hoods. They covered their faces with pastes of lead and vinegar, chopped dust, and crushed pearl. These cosmetics could rot the skin, cause lesions, or slowly poison the body, but they created, if only for a time, the prized look of ethereal beauty. Some women bled themselves to achieve a ghostly pallor. Others painted blue veins on their temples to appear more delicate. Still others went so far as to avoid certain foods, fearing they might ruddy the cheeks or darken the complexion. In a world without modern skincare, these rituals were extreme, but they were expected. Among peasants, the pressure remained, though the means were fewer. A girl with naturally lighter skin might be treated more favorably. Mothers whispered old recipes, milk washes, oatmeal soaks, ways to lighten freckles or fade sunburn. But for most, the sun was unavoidable. They worked beneath it, walked beneath it, grew old beneath it. And the tan that marked their skin became a kind of public declaration of class, of labor, of limitation. To have tanned skin was not just seen as unseemly. It was sometimes taken as a mark of moral failing. A woman who appeared weathered was assumed to be careless, or worse, unchaste. After all, if she had been where the sun could see her, who else had seen her too? This thinking bled into literature and art. In illuminated manuscripts, beautiful women were often drawn as pale, even ghostly, while old women, witches, or temptresses were painted with darker, ruddier skin. Beauty, purity, and power became entwined. And yet, the irony was brutal. The very things that made a woman healthy, movement, fresh air, work, strength, were the things she was punished for showing. A robust complexion meant vitality. But it did not mean marriage. It did not mean poems. It did not mean safety. For women of color, for travelers, for anyone whose skin did not conform to the ideal, life was even more perilous. They were often viewed as exotic curiosities at best, and dangerous outcasts at worst. Their beauty was admired but never fully accepted, and their difference was often used against them. So women powdered and painted, sheltered and disguised. They chased a beauty that denied their bodies what they needed most: sunlight, nourishment, truth. And they passed those rituals to their daughters, who inherited not just the methods, but the madness. In the end, the pursuit of pale beauty was never about attraction. It was about control, about making a woman appear fragile, contained and touched, the very qualities that made her easier to own. If the skin was a canvas of virtue, then hair was the crown upon it. And in medieval Europe, that crown was expected to shine like sunlight through flax. Blonde hair, above all other shades, was celebrated. It was likened to angels, to saints, to divine light. In stories and songs, maidens of beauty always seemed to have golden tresses that fell in waves, long, soft, and scented. And so, women did what they could and what they must to chase that ideal, no matter the cost. In truth, most medieval women did not naturally have blonde hair. In northern Europe, many had brown or dark hues. In the south, richer shades of black or chestnut. But the poets and painters who set the tone for beauty often chose to elevate the lightest strands, turning them into symbols of purity and favor. Blonde hair became associated not just with beauty but with holiness, softness, and virtue. To achieve this color artificially was no small task. Women rinsed their hair in lye, soaked it in vinegar and herbs, or used concoctions made of ashes, saffron, or crushed roots. They sat in the sun for hours, veiled in thin cloths, hoping to lighten their locks with heat and time. These treatments left hair brittle, damaged, and often foul-smelling, but when the strands caught the light, just so, the effect was considered worth it. Texture, too, was a battlefield. Loose waves were seen as soft and feminine, but too much curl might be considered wild or unnatural. Straight hair could be elegant, but also plain, and no matter the shape. The most important rule was modesty. The hair should not be seen too freely, For a respectable woman, hair was both sacred and dangerous. It was bound in braids, coiled in buns, hidden beneath wimples or veils. A glimpse of a woman's hair in public was often associated with immodesty or even sin. The church taught that a woman's hair was a source of temptation. St. Paul had warned of it. Artists painted it spilling like fire on Eve or twisted like snares around men's hearts. So brides tucked it up, widows shaved it off, nuns covered it forever. And yet, within the privacy of homes or among female company, hair was a form of quiet rebellion. Women styled it with care, adorned it with ribbons, oils, or combs. Mothers taught daughters to braid with precision, to oil and wrap, to protect it against the straw and soot of daily life. Even among peasants, where time was precious and tools, where few hair was not neglected, it was a source of pride, one of the only adornments that could not be taken away by poverty. Wigs and hairpieces were also common among the wealthier classes, especially when age or illness stole the luster of youth. Some wore false braids made of horsehair or imported strands. Others padded their veils to give the illusion of greater volume. A high forehead was in fashion, so women plucked their hairlines, sometimes well into the middle of their scalp, to create a rounder, broader brow. The pain was real, but so was the pressure. There was power in hair, not just in its appearance, but in its symbolism. To let it down was to speak a language that everyone understood. A loose braid at a feast might say, "I am young and playful." A covered head in church meant humility. And when a woman unbound her hair in mourning or rage, it was seen as an act of grief too deep for words. So hair became another measure of the impossible. It must be long, but not too wild, golden, but not artificially so, present, but not revealed. It must be seen as beautiful, but never offered, adored, but always controlled. And behind it all, beneath every veil and pin, there remained a quiet truth, that beauty, once again, was not something a woman was born with. It was something she had to suffer for. In the quiet candlelight of a medieval chamber, a woman stood still while her maid pulled tightly at the cords of her garment. The linen bit into her ribs, her breath came shorter with each tug, but this was not a scene of punishment. It was one of preparation, for to appear graceful, delicate, and refined, she must be constrained. In medieval Europe, the female form was not simply admired. It was sculpted, adjusted, and pressed to match ideals set by poets and preachers alike. A small waist, narrow shoulders, modest bosom, hips just wide enough to suggest fertility, but never indulgence. This vision, like many in the era, was not born of reality, but of symbolism. A woman's body was meant to reflect not only beauty but morality, discipline, self-control. And so, the shaping began. Long before the corsets of later centuries, women wore kirtles and underdresses with lacing that could be tightened, sometimes dramatically. Stays and stiffened bodices appeared, lined with reeds or bones. These weren't always worn for support. They were meant to change a woman's silhouette, to make her look less like a living creature, and more like a painting. Smooth, contained, controlled clothing added illusion where the body did not comply. Padding was used to round shoulders or hips. Layers were piled to disguise a broader frame. Belts were tightened high above the waist to give the illusion of a slender middle. Even the length of sleeves and the width of a neckline played a role in shaping perception. But shaping the body wasn't always done through dress alone. Some noble women bound their breasts to keep them from developing too much, fearing a full chest might be read as vulgar or lustful. Others learned to sit, walk, and even breathe in ways that disguised their true form. Back straight, chin down, movements delicate, always aware of how they might appear from across a hall. Pregnancy, though necessary, had to be navigated carefully. Fertility was admired, but obvious signs of it were not. Gowns were redesigned to drape gracefully over swelling bellies. Phrases were invented to avoid mentioning the body outright. A lady was not with child, she was nearly. in condition. Even in death, beauty was enforced. Noble women who died young were laid out with their hands folded over flat corseted bellies, veils perfectly placed, cheeks dusted with powder, a lifetime of discipline preserved for eternity. Among peasants, such shaping was less extreme. The pressure remained. A girl might be mocked for being too broad, too sturdy, too plain. Mothers passed on tricks, how to walk lightly, how to tilt one's head to seem gentler, how to carry burdens low to avoid broadening the back. The result was a world in which a woman's body was never quite her own. It was a display, a performance, a message written in fabric and posture. And the cruelty of it was this: the most admired bodies were often the ones least capable of real life, too delicate to labor, too restrained to run, too faint to eat with joy. It is tempting to think of beauty as something light, as joy, as charm. But in medieval Europe, it was often another weight a woman had to carry, a burden of shaping, shrinking, silencing. And the more beautiful she appeared, the less freedom she had. In the flickering candlelight of a medieval bedchamber, where shadows stretched across uneven stone walls and rushes crunched faintly underfoot, a young woman might stand still as her maidservant fastened the cords at her back. Slowly, methodically, the girdle would tighten, its woven threads pulling taut around her midsection, compressing her breath, reshaping her form, not for comfort, not for health, but for beauty. Though the corset, as we think of it today, evolved later in the Middle Ages and early Renaissance, its ancestor was already well known. The stiffened bodice, the linen girdle, the underdress reinforced with whalebone, wood or iron strips. These were not soft garments. They were instruments of discipline. Beauty was not effortless. It was labor, confinement, and quiet submission. A woman's waistline mattered. To have a narrow middle, to appear cinched, delicate, almost fragile, was considered ideal. It gave the illusion of youth, of daintiness, of upper-class refinement. And so, from early girlhood, many were introduced to the rituals of shaping the body, not with exercise or diet, but with binding. Cloth was wrapped tightly. Belts were drawn. Shoulders were pressed back. Ribs tucked in. Some women bruised from the pressure. Others fainted in the summer heat, unable to draw a full breath. But all knew that to remove the girdle, to let the body return to its natural shape, was to risk being labeled unruly, unkempt, or worse, undesirable. There was symbolism here, too. A girdled body was a controlled body. It signaled obedience. It said, I belong to someone, and I behave accordingly. For married women, it hinted at chastity and loyalty. For unmarried girls, it whispered of readiness. And for all, it was a quiet declaration that beauty, like virtue, must be tightly held in place. Even the garments layered over the girdle conspired in this performance. Long gowns with flowing sleeves emphasized the contrast between the voluminous and the constrained. The torso was the centerpiece, smooth, stiff, and unmoving. Embroidered hems and fine fabrics could signal wealth, but a poorly shaped waistline could undo all else. Among the nobility, competition was fierce. Women eyed each other's silhouettes at feasts and dances, noting who had the smallest waist, the highest bust, the most refined posture. Rumors whispered in corridors about hidden laces, false panels, or maids who pulled too tightly. Jealousy bloomed behind veils and fans. But among the peasantry, though factions were simpler, the influence still spread. A well-laced bodice might be worn to market or festival, hand-stitched from coarse linen, but tied all the same. Girls imitated what they saw in town, even if their tools were rougher. And the message was the same: shape yourself, restrain yourself, present yourself. Rare were the women who could escape the pressure, literal and societal. To breathe freely was to risk standing apart, and standing apart was dangerous. Some rebelled quietly. They loosened their ties after dark, sighed with relief by candlelight, or whispered of days when they could dress only for warmth. But in the light of morning, the girdle returned, the expectation held fast. Even in death the shaping persisted, effigies, and tomb sculptures showed noble women with impossibly narrow waists. Serene expressions carved above corseted forms, as if to say beauty must outlast the flesh, as if, even in stone, they had to appear bound. So the girdle was never just fabric. It was a promise, a prison, a performance. And each time it tightened, it reminded her, the beautiful woman does not move too freely. She does not breathe too deeply. She does not belong entirely to herself. In the tapestry of medieval ideals, one color ruled them all: white, not the warm ivory of candlelight or the soft blush of cream, but pure, stark, and blemished white, skin like moonlight, skin like untouched parchment, skin untouched by sun, labor, or blemish. Pale skin wasn't just an aesthetic choice. It was proof of wealth, of class, of virtue. And so, women went to extraordinary lengths to attain it, painful lengths, sometimes even fatal ones. A lady who toiled in the fields bore the sun's mark, bronzed arms, weathered cheeks, lines etched by wind and work. But a noble woman, she must appear untouched by such things. Her face had to glow faintly like alabaster, under her veil, as if kissed by divinity, not daylight. To tan was to fall, to whiten was to rise. And so came the powders, chuck ground fine, lead mixed into pastes, vinegar and mercury combined into bleaching agents, all applied in layers, smoothed over the face with cloth or fingertips. The result might appear radiant in candlelight, glowing even, but beneath it, the skin suffocated, pores clogged, rashes bloomed, lips cracked, hair fell, teeth loosened. Still, the paler a woman appeared, the more beautiful she was said to be. To mask the damage, even more powder, even more lead. Some women kept to the shade entirely. Wide-brimmed hoods, thick veils, long gloves, parasols of woven linen, not out of piety, but protection. Even a stroll in the garden could darken the brow or pink the nose, and that would not do. Others bathed in concoctions of milk and crushed pearl, or applied poultices of rye and flour. Recipes passed from mother to daughter with a whisper: how to banish a freckle, how to soften a bruise, how to soothe the burn of last week's mask. And yet, the irony was that real health, fresh blood, sunlight, and a body well fed often stood at odds with these ideals. Pale did not always mean well. It meant withdrawn, bloodless, fate. These were qualities praised in poems: the fair maiden, the fragile flower, the girl too delicate to speak above a whisper. For the medieval woman, beauty was not robust. It was ghostly. Some women even drew their own blood, just a drop, to better hollow the cheeks or deepen the shadows beneath the eyes. Others painted faint blue veins along their temples, to hint at translucence, to be seen and unseen at once. And still, none of it was truly enough, because as skin whitened, new standards arose. No spots, no pits, no wrinkles. To age was to fail. And since even the fairest complexions bore marks of time, the rituals only deepened. More paint, more masks, more denial. In private, the toll was visible: scars from abscesses, faces that cracked with expression, fevers that came and went, and beneath the surface, the slow creeping of poison, lead in the blood, mercury in the organs, vision clouding with each passing year. Some women died younger than they should have. Some spent their final days in spasms or silence. And still, their faces were powdered for burial. To be pale was to be prized. To be perfect was to be false. And to seek that perfection, it was a journey of pain, of cost, of loss. In pursuit of beauty, many women of the medieval world became ghosts of themselves long before they were laid to rest. It begins at the crown of the head, with strands of chestnut, gold, or flaxen hair, spilling over shoulders, braided into loops, or hidden beneath fabric. In the medieval world, hair was never just hair. It was a symbol, a temptation, a ritual, and a burden. Beauty, in part, lived in the hair, and so it had to be perfect. But perfect did not mean natural. It meant controlled, it meant styled, it meant sacrificed. A maiden's hair was her pride, a marker of youth and purity. Let loose, it flowed like a river down her back at festivals or on her wedding day long. Healthy hair was linked to fertility and virtue. A virgin's hair might be left uncovered on special days, an offering to the eye, but never to the hand. For once a woman married, her hair became something else, dangerous. It was hidden, bound, pinned and veiled and covered beneath linen coifs, wimples, or nets of gold thread. Not only for modesty, though modesty was the excuse, but to signal ownership. A woman's hair, once loose and wild, was now contained. She belonged to someone. The uncovered head of a married woman was scandalous. A woman without a veil could be mistaken for a prostitute. A flash of exposed braid could bring shame. And so countless hours were spent wrapping, sewing, twisting. And yet, paradoxically, beauty still demanded attention to the very thing it hid. Hair had to be clean, lustrous, well-scented. Herbal rinses with rosemary, nettle, or vinegar were common. Some women rinsed with beer to give shine, others dusted their hair with ground iris root to perfume it. Hair was lightened with lemon and sun, darkened with ash or walnut hulls, combed endlessly, trimmed carefully, treasured secretly. For noble women, hair was also a performance. Elaborate braids coiled around the ears, or towers of hair rose beneath veils, padded with fabric or horsehair to create shapes. Metal hair cages, known as hennins, could lift veils into towering cones. And though the hair beneath might be nearly invisible, the effort to arrange it never ceased. Some even plucked hair from their foreheads and temples to achieve the high, smooth brow that fashion deemed beautiful. Painful, yes, but in the name of elegance, pain was expected. Among peasants, hair was simpler, but no less meaningful. Girls wore ribbons on feast days. Married women bound their braids under plain cloth. Yet even in labor, they followed the silent rules. Hair must be neat, covered, controlled, because to appear disheveled was to invite judgment. And to appear too proud in one's appearance was equally dangerous. There was a fine line between pride and virtue. A woman with hair too long might be admired or envied. A woman with hair too clean might be questioned. And a woman who refused to veil at all, punished. In courtly love poems, hair was often compared to gold, to silk, to fields of ripe grain. But in reality, that gold had to be grown, groomed, and hidden. The object of desire was also the object of discipline. Even for men, hair mattered. A knight might wear his hair to the shoulders, curled or bound with a ribbon. A priest's tonsure marked him as set apart. And among monks, bald crowns symbolized humility, a rejection of vanity. Hair was always saying something, even when it was gone. In the end, medieval hair was not just about beauty. It was about identity, about class, about morality, and above all, about control. The crown of the head held more than hair. It held centuries of expectation. When one imagines a medieval lady at her toilet, the image often fades into simplicity. A basin of water, a cloth, perhaps a comb. But in truth, beneath the quiet veils and modest smiles, there was color. And not just in fabric or embroidery, but on the face itself, delicately, secretly, carefully. Because while beauty was praised, its tools were suspect. And rouge, red, was both the promise of allure and the whisper of sin. The cheeks, in medieval beauty standards, were supposed to be flushed subtly, like the blush of a maiden surprised. Rosy cheeks meant health, youth, fertility. But natural blush faded with time, fatigue, and hardship. So women learned to create the illusion. Crushed berries, beetroot, red wine residue, and even vermilion made from mercury were dabbed onto the skin, a tiny bit on each cheek, blended, just enough not to look painted. The art was to seem touched while being entirely touched. Lips, too, were expected to be red, not garishly, but like ripened fruit. Poppy petals soaked in oil, mulberry juice, red ochre. Some used burnt rose petals or steeped saffron for a softer tone, but always with care to bold a color. and one risked being seen as vain or worse, seductive, because in medieval moral teaching, red was the color of temptation, of Eve's apple, of the whore of Babylon's cloak. To wear red on the face was, in the minds of some preachers, to wear a lie, a mask, a tool of seduction meant to lead men astray. And yet, the sane men admired it. Poets praised lips like cherries and cheeks like sunrise. Knights composed ballads too. Rose petal, mouths, and so women quietly continued the ritual. The paradox deepened. In church paintings of Mary showed her pale, almost translucent, the virgin ideal. But in the courts of noble houses, the ladies were flushed with careful rouge, their mouths darkened just enough to stand out by candlelight. The dim glow made their cheeks appear livelier, their smiles more enchanting. It was a careful magic. Some women took it further. They tinted their nails. They used herbs to darken eyelashes or brows. They lined their eyes with soot or crushed antimony. The results were soft, often beautiful, always dangerous, because to alter the face was to risk accusations of vanity, of sorcery, of deceit. A woman who wore too much rouge might be accused of trying to ensnare a man. A married woman with reddened lips might be whispered about. A widow with a flush might be mocked. And so the line between enhancement and transgression was razor thin. There were those who condemned it outright. Church sermons warned against the painted face. Moral texts called it the devil's deceit. But the practice never stopped. It simply went underground, into kitchens, behind curtains, passed from hand to hand in coded recipes, beauty secrets written in the margins of herbals, hidden in the folds of apron pockets, whispered among sisters and servants. And still the damage came. Some rouge caused burns, others carried toxins. Mercury seeped through pores, ochres scraped the skin, yet women persisted. Because beauty was currency, it bought favor, it brought admiration. It made a life of restriction slightly more bearable, even if it could not be shown to openly. In the end, rouge was more than color. It was resistance. It was artistry. It was danger wrapped in silk. A single dab on the cheek, and a woman could be saint, siren, or sinner, depending on who was looking, and all the while she looked into her reflection, such as it was, and wondered if the blush was hers, or just the mask she had learned to wear. If the medieval world loved pale skin and golden hair, it revered another form of beauty just as much, one that could not be painted or brewed, but had to be forced, shaped, and maintained with daily restraint. The body, more specifically, the shape of it, not too full, but not too thin, curved, but contained, slender, but strong, and above all small. It was a beauty standard that spoke not just to appearance, but to discipline, to control, to pain endured in silence. In noble courts and among wealthy households, the desired silhouette of a woman was often narrow and upright. A willowy figure was admired, not just for its delicacy, but for what it symbolized: refinement, virtue, modesty. To appear wide or unbound was, in some eyes, a sign of indulgence or wildness. So garments were designed to correct what nature gave and press it toward what society demanded. Enter the corset's ancestor. Though the corset as we think of it today did not exist in early medieval Europe, there were bodices, stays, and tight-laced garments that served similar functions. Long, stiffened panels of cloth were laced tightly across the torso, often reinforced with whalebone or wood. Linen chemises underneath protected the skin, but did little to soften the pressure. Some bodices were so tight they left bruises, others restricted movement. In extreme cases, later in history, but rooted here, women fainted not because of drama, but because their breath had nowhere to go. And still they wore them, because, without the lacing, the dress did not fall properly. The neckline sagged. The outer gown looked wrong. Appearance was everything, and suffering for beauty was not a complaint, it was a virtue. Waists were emphasized with belts and girdles. In some cases, Bodices were designed to push the breasts upward and together, but without revealing them. A paradox, to appear full and youthful, but never overtly sensual. Clothes hid much but implied more, and underneath, the body was slowly being molded, bones pushed inward, ribs compressed, backs held rigid by lacing and posture boards. There was no yoga, no stretching, only stillness. The ideal woman moved gracefully, but never rushed. She stood tall, but never slouched. She endured, but never showed strain. Among poorer women, the standards were not so strict. Function mattered more than form. But even here, there were pressures. Brides were expected to appear slim and modest. Mothers were told to recover their figure after birth, not with rest, but with binding. There was always something to tuck, tighten, or hide. And for some women, the pressure came not from garments, but from gaze. A nobleman might favor a new servant because of her small waist. A husband might comment on his wife's figure after childbirth. A mother might tighten her daughter's belt just a bit more before the Sunday procession. Over time, the body learned to adapt. Muscles grew sore, breath came shorter. But the outer silhouette remained clean, controlled, composed. What the world saw was a figure of grace. What the woman felt was the ache beneath. And still, she walked. She sat with folded hands. She danced at feasts, smiling between shallow breaths. She endured, because to be beautiful, she had learned, was not just to appear lovely. It was to be still, quiet, contained. And if she suffered, well, that was part of the charm. In the silent ritual of mourning, where the only light might be the flicker of a tallow candle or the soft gray of dawn through leaded windows, women once again prepared their faces for the world. But this chapter of the face, the brow, was perhaps the most quietly controlled. The eyes, poets said, were windows to the soul, and the brows, the drapery that framed them. Not just beauty, but morality was traced in every arch and line. To understand the medieval obsession with the brow, we must first understand what they feared. Hair, not the flowing tresses of the head, but the suggestion of coarseness, of disorder, of wildness that excess hair implied. A smooth face was not just lovely, it was spiritual. And so, from noble women in French courts to peasant girls preparing for market, the tweezing began. Eyebrows were thinned, sometimes removed entirely. A high, smooth brow, long, wide, pale, was the most desirable. It was seen as a sign of intelligence, grace, and chastity. To achieve it, women would pluck for hours, removing hairs from the temples and top of the forehead. Some even applied vinegar and walnut oil mixtures to slow regrowth. Others used pumice stones or crude razors. The ideal face was oval, and the forehead was meant to be its crown. Art from the period shows us the lengths women went to. Eyebrows barely visible, hairlines pushed back by strategic removal, faces appearing as bare canvases on which modesty could be displayed. But the act was not always secret. It could be a bonding ritual among women, mothers teaching daughters how to hold the tweezers made of bone or bronze, sisters sitting by the hearth plucking one another's brows with care and quiet complaint. Even noble women waiting in their chambers would pluck before dressing, knowing their appearances would be read like scripture. As with rouge, there were critics. Some preachers condemned the alteration of the God-given face. To pluck was to defy divine intention, yet it continued, quietly and determinedly, like so many aspects of beauty that tiptoed the line between vanity and virtue. And for those who could not or would not pluck, there were ways to disguise: hoods pulled lower, hair brushed forward in fringe like waves, or, in rare cases, small patches of false skin, tiny masks of paste or cloth, glued just at the brow line to smooth and conceal. Men, too, took note. A woman with a high forehead was said to be refined, wise, and well-bred. Poets praised the wide brow of my lady as if it were a field to be gazed upon. A smooth brow suggested calm, a furrowed one, distress, And so women learned to manage not only the shape of their brows but the tension of them, to appear serene even when they were not. It was a quiet war against hair, against judgment, against time. Each morning, the mirror, if there was one, offered a test, not just of beauty, but of discipline. A woman who failed to pluck, who let her brows grow wild, might be read as slovenly, passionate, even unruly. In a world where women's power was limited, the brow could speak volumes, and so they shaped it carefully, precisely, not for vanity, but for survival. In medieval society, the ideal woman did not only look a certain way, she also behaved a certain way. Beauty was not just in the bones, skin, or fabric, but in demeanor. It was a performance, rehearsed in silence. And nowhere was this more evident than in the expectation that a beautiful woman must be quiet. To speak too often, or too loudly, was frowned upon. Chatter suggested frivolity. Wit, while admired in men, could be dangerous. A woman, even threatening, a lady who spoke her mind, risked ridicule. A girl who giggled too freely might be seen as wild. And so silence became part of the beauty code. Paintings and illuminated manuscripts show women with downcast eyes, soft expressions, and closed lips. These were the admired traits: meekness, humility, composure. A beautiful woman did not seek attention. She received it quietly, modestly, passively. Her stillness was part of her allure. This quiet was cultivated from childhood. Girls were taught to speak only when spoken to. At table, they were to serve before eating. In gatherings, they were to listen before responding. In confession, they were to whisper. In court, they were to weep if needed, but never to argue. Even laughter was supposed to be restrained. A soft smile was preferred over a loud cackle. Eyes were not to roll or dart or linger too long. They were to glance, then drop. A flirtatious look, if offered, had to seem accidental. And yet, women were observed constantly, watched by fathers, brothers, priests, lords, judged by neighbors, gossiped about by other women, admired or condemned by strangers. Their silence was filled with pressure. It was not freedom. It was a performance under constant scrutiny. There were exceptions, of course: queens who advised their kings, nuns who taught in scriptoria, midwives who gave orders in birthing rooms. But in public, even these women knew when to lower their voices. Respect was often tied to stillness. In the home, silence meant obedience. In the street, it meant virtue. In the chapel, it meant piety. And so, to be beautiful in the eyes of society was to learn the art of stillness, not just in posture, but in presence. And what of the woman who longed to speak, to laugh freely, to share her thoughts or raise her voice? She had to weigh the cost, because her beauty, so often praised, was also a leash. Too much personality, and she was difficult. Too many opinions, and she was unruly. Too much sound, and she was no longer lovely. So she smiled softly. She listened attentively. She held her hands together and her thoughts inside. And when the moment allowed, behind a door, beside a hearth, or in whispers between women, she spoke, briefly, carefully, quietly. Because in a world where beauty demanded silence, every word was a risk, and an act of defiance. To modern minds, a healthy glow, a sun-kissed complexion, is often seen as vibrant, full of life. But in medieval Europe, that same bronze hue meant something very different. It meant labor. It meant toil under the open sun, the burning in fields, the sweating at ovens. And so beauty was rewritten as absence. The absence of sun, of blood, of blemish. The highest standard was pale. The paler, the better. A noble woman's skin was to resemble milk or marble, or fine parchment, smooth, luminous, and touched by heat or work. It was a kind of visual shorthand for class. To be pale was to be pampered. It meant one did not harvest wheat or churn butter. It meant one's hands remained soft and one's body stayed indoors. Achieving this ideal, however, took effort, Nature rarely delivered the perfect porcelain skin expected by poets and painters, so women reached for tools. Some applied mixtures made from white lead and vinegar, a toxic combination that smoothed and bleached the skin but slowly poisoned it. Others used crushed lily petals, egg whites, or powdered bone. Some women, especially those in wealthier courts, would bleed themselves slightly, just enough to drain some color from their cheeks. They might drink vinegar to suppress appetite and pinkness. They might even avoid fireplaces, even in bitter winters, for fear of flushing their skin. This pursuit of pallor could turn dangerous, yet for many it was worth the risk. Paintings from the time show faces like moonlight, round, pale, with a faint bluish tint. The lips might have color, and the eyes might be rimmed gently with kohl or ash, but the skin was to be light, matte. Freckles were a flaw. Moles, unless perfectly placed, were suspicious. Redness was an embarrassment. A woman born with dark or olive skin might never be considered a true beauty in her time. Her features could be praised, her hair, perhaps, or her eyes, but her skin would be a mark against her. How beauty was not only visual, it was cultural. It reinforced the divide between labor and leisure, between peasantry and nobility, between those exposed and those protected. There were critics of this ideal, even then. Some poets wrote of sun-browned shepherdesses with affection. Some religious texts warned against vanity. But still, the paintings told a different tale. Pale cheeks, pale necks, pale fingers holding fans or rosaries, pale women standing by windows and touched by wind or warmth. And so the women of the time powdered their faces and covered their arms. They sheeted themselves with hoods and veils. They walked in shadows. They sacrificed the joy of sunlight for the illusion of status, because, in the quiet language of medieval beauty, the palest woman was the most precious. In an age when appearance could shape a woman's fate, in marriage, in court, in favor, cosmetics became both a tool of survival and a quiet rebellion. But what passed for beauty in the medieval world was often a perilous pursuit, because many of the powders, pastes, and paints used to perfect the face came laced with danger. Quite literally, there was no regulation, no list of approved ingredients, and no understanding of toxicology. A potion passed from mother to daughter, or whispered in a lady's chamber, might promise radiance, but deliver illness. Pale skin was prized, so women applied mixtures of white lead, vinegar, chalk, and even arsenic. Lead in particular clung easily to the skin and gave it a porcelain gleam, but it also seeped through the pores, destroying tissue, blackening the teeth, and over time, killing slowly. Rouge for the cheeks and lips was made from red ochre. Crushed berries, or cinnabar, a bright mineral that, like lead, was beautiful and lethal. It burned slightly as it was applied. That pain, they believed, brought a bloom to the cheek, and the bloom was necessary. Pale skin without color appeared sickly, but just the right tint, carefully dotted on with cloth or fingertip, signaled youth, vitality, and sensuality. For the eyes, women turned to soot, ash, or powdered antimony. This dark dust would be gently brushed along the lashes or lids to make the eyes appear larger, more defined. It worked, but at a cost. Frequent use could blur vision or inflame the skin, and yet it persisted because wide eyes were considered innocent, alluring, and ideal. Some women plucked their eyebrows completely, only to redraw them higher on the forehead to lengthen the face. Others used honey or wax to remove facial hair, or rubbed the skin with pumice stones to smooth its surface, all in the name of refinement. To soften the hands, women soaked them in milk or rose water. To sweeten the breath, they chewed parsley or cloves. To perfume the body, in an era before soap was widespread, they dabbed themselves with oils steeped in lavender, violet, or rosemary. These rituals were delicate, repetitive, and often secret, but not all women had access to such tools. The beauty rituals of the wealthy differed from those of the poor. A peasant girl might rub her cheeks for color with a pinched finger or wash her face in stream water. A merchant's wife might invest in a single pot of balm that would last a season. Only the truly elite could afford the full array of powders, mirrors, and ointments imported from Venice or the East. Even then, using too much was a risk. To be too made up was to be suspected of vanity, or worse, seduction. The church frowned upon artificial beauty. A painted face, it warned, was a lie, a mask of sin. And yet, women painted still. They powdered in private, applied rouge behind chamber screens, and touched up their lips in candlelight because in a world where appearance was currency, cosmetics were more than decoration. They were armor, they were hope, they were danger wrapped in silk. And for many, they were the only tools they had in the cold, candlelit halls of medieval manors and the rush-strewn chambers of noble homes. Beauty was not only in the face, it was in the form, and no feature drew more whispered scrutiny, more jealous sighs or private efforts than the waist. A slender waist, narrow, delicate, almost fragile, was the height of desirability. And for many medieval women, that meant one thing: compression, though the corset as we imagine it wouldn't fully develop until later centuries. The roots of body binding existed already in the Middle Ages. Garments like the kirtle or the cotehardie, laced tightly over the torso, shaped the body into long vertical lines. A woman's silhouette was to be smooth and lean, emphasizing the length of the neck, the slope of the shoulder, and the curve of the waist before the fullness of the skirt. This was a visual poem of grace and restraint. Some women wrapped bands of linen beneath their dresses to flatten or shape their midsections. Others wore stiffened bodices reinforced with reeds, bone, or tightly woven canvas. The aim was not to emphasize curves, not in the modern sense, but to refine the figure, to suggest self-control, to appear almost ethereal. A body that looked too fleshy could be mocked as coarse. A plump waistline was associated with overindulgence, so women cinched and smoothed and stretched their posture to appear thinner, taller, more composed. But this slender ideal was hard to reach. Food in noble courts was rich and plentiful, and many women were sedentary, and so diets emerged, not official, written diets as we know them now, but whispered instructions from one lady to another: eat less bread, chew mint to dull hunger, sip vinegar or wine to suppress appetite, walk briskly in the gallery before dawn. Some women simply skipped meals, hiding their refusals beneath talk of piety or illness, pregnancy, to change the body. And though it was celebrated in a wife, it also risked reshaping the ideal form. After childbirth, some noble women wore tight sashes around their waists to bring back their figure, even when their bodies were weak. Their beauty, it seemed, was not theirs to protect, but theirs to preserve for others. Tailors and seamstresses were both allies and enforcers. They cut gowns with ever narrower bodices, creating clothes that demanded a certain body, or reshaped one. Servants learned how to lace tight, how to layer fabrics to disguise. A skilled lady's maid could make a waist appear inches smaller, without a word spoken. And then there were the dangers: fainting in chapels, lightheadedness at feasts, pain in the ribs after a long ride. But these, too, were sometimes seen as signs of refinement. A woman who swooned delicately, who walked slowly with perfect posture, who needed to rest often. Was she not more beautiful for it? Was she not closer to the image of the perfect, pale, fragile noble woman seen in tapestries? And so the waist remained a silent battlefield, a line not of fabric, but of expectation. A place where the natural body met the demands of fantasy, a shape that could never quite be kept, but always had to be chased. In a world of strict roles and sharper gazes, the ideal waist was more than an aesthetic. It was a symbol of status, control, and quiet sacrifice. In the medieval imagination, no symbol of beauty was more potent or more fraught than a woman's hair. It shimmered in poetry, tumbled through illuminated manuscripts, and framed the faces of saints and sirens alike. It was her crown and her shame, her pride and her peril, because in the Middle Ages, hair was never just hair. It was meaning. Golden hair, long, thick, and flowing, was the ideal. Not because it was most common, it wasn't, but because it was most rare. Blonde was associated with youth, with purity, with angelic radiance. In Christian art, the Virgin Mary was often shown with golden tresses. So too were queens and noble ladies in courtly literature. And because it was rare, it became powerful, something to imitate, something to chase. Women who were not blonde, which was most, sometimes tried to become so. Recipes for lightening the hair included mixtures of saffron, alum, and even urine. Others exposed their hair to the sun for hours, hoping it would fade to the right shade of gold. Some soaked it in lye water, brushing it through with fine combs. The results varied from softening and lightening to breakage and burns, but the goal remained constant, a paler, softer hue. But it wasn't only color that mattered, length and texture, too. Carried weight, loose hair, falling over the shoulders, was associated with virginity or eroticism. Wives, widows, and women of age were expected to cover their hair. Modesty required veils, wimples, or headdresses. Yet, in private, many women took their hair down, combing it slowly before the hearth, or letting it dry in the sun after washing. To lose one's hair, through illness, age, or misfortune, was devastating. Some women padded their braids with wool or added false plaits made from horsehair or another woman's locks. A full head of hair suggested vitality, wealth, and divine favor. Thin or patchy hair was not only undesirable, it could be read as a sign of sin, punishment, or spiritual decay. Monastic women shaved or covered their hair completely, giving up beauty for devotion. Prostitutes, by contrast, often wore their hair elaborately, decorated with ribbons or beads. The contrast was stark and intentional. One style suggested humility, the other, temptation. Men, too, watched closely. A glimpse of unbound hair in the wrong place, a market, a church, a courtyard, could become the subject of gossip or scandal. A lady's hair, after all, was seen as both her ornament and her weapon. It was beauty you could not touch, a softness that suggested closeness and danger. Artists painted it in waves. Poets compared it to silk, to sunlight, to gold wire and wild grain. And women, in turn, treated it with reverence, washing it with herbs, braiding it with care, sleeping with it wrapped in cloth to preserve its smoothness. Yet for all this, hair was also a burden, a thing that must be kept, hidden, perfected, tamed, a source of judgment, a line between virtue and vanity. And so, in the quiet corners of the medieval world, by hearths, in gardens, behind chamber screens, women tended their hair not just with combs, but with fear and hope. Because in that long, shining strand was the reflection of how the world saw them, and how, perhaps, they wished to be seen. In the long shadows of the medieval world, a woman's beauty was never hers alone. It belonged to the gaze, to the onlookers, the judges, the quiet murmurs in corridors, and the bold pronouncements in market squares. From the moment she was old enough to be noticed, she was measured, not just in worth, but in symmetry, softness, paleness, grace, her walk, her speech, the curve of her cheek, and the line of her brow. Beauty was not just admired, it was expected. It was not enough to be good, one had to appear good, and that appearance, too often, meant looking the way others thought goodness should look, demure, calm, smooth-skinned, and soft-voiced. A flushed face could mean illness, but it could also mean impropriety. A laugh too loud might be charming, or it might be shameful. The line was never fixed. It shifted with every eye that looked. In the manor, the village, even the cloister, women learned early to observe themselves from the outside. They adjusted their hoods, they folded their hands, they bit their tongues, and practiced smiles in the reflection of polished metal. A mother might whisper, "Keep your chin tucked." A nurse might say, Too much sun and you'll go brown. A friend might sigh, she's beautiful, but only if she stays thin. And so beauty became a kind of performance, not a celebration of self, but a shield, a negotiation. A hope that if one looked the right way, spoke the right way, moved the right way, life might be kinder, doors might open, scorn might be avoided, one might with care survive the game. Even holy texts reminded women to be modest, but modesty, too, had its look. Too plain, and she was mocked. Too adorned, and she was rebuked. The balance was delicate, the judgment constant. A single glance could raise a woman's place in the eyes of her community, or crush her reputation. Underfoot, beauty was weaponized both by and against women. The pretty girl might be favored or envied. The plain girl might be overlooked or pitied, and sometimes cruelly. The same woman could be all of these things, depending on who stood beside her or who whispered behind her back. In illuminated margins of medieval manuscripts, women were sometimes drawn as angels, sometimes as monsters. The face changed depending on the story being told. And so it was in real life. One moment a saint, the next a temptation, the next a fool. Her appearance became a canvas for others' projections. Rarely, if ever, was she simply herself. And all the while the gaze continued, watching, measuring, deciding, even at home, especially at home, that watchfulness remained. Servants watched mistresses, mothers watched daughters, husbands watched wives. Even the mirror, for those who had one, seemed to hold judgment in its silent surface. To survive such a world required more than beauty. It required resilience, the ability to bend and not break, to see one's worth in other things, in kindness, cleverness, care, even when the world only saw skin and bone and grace. And in quiet moments, perhaps by a hearth at night or a garden wall in the morning mist, a woman might touch her face and wonder, if no one was watching, who would she be? Because the most brutal standard of all was not the ideal itself, but the fear of failing it. There comes a moment, quiet, slow, almost imperceptible, when the mirror changes. It may not be a glass mirror. It may be the surface of a basin, the eyes of a child, or the silence in a room where once there was praise. But the moment comes, the skin softens, then sags, the brightness dims, the hands, once smooth, show lines like threads of a forgotten tapestry. The world does not gasp. It does not pause. It simply stops looking. In the medieval world, a woman's value, her safety, her future, even her soul in the minds of some, had long been tied to how she looked. And so, what happened when beauty slipped away? The answer was often grief. Not loud grief, not the grief of death, but the small, quiet sorrow of vanishing, of becoming invisible. A noble woman whose cheeks once blushed with crushed rose petals might find her mirror a stranger. Her daughters may surpass her. Her husband, once tender, now looks past. The serving girl stifles a yawn while dressing her hair. In the corner of a tapestry, a faded goddess stands still, once admired, now unnoticed. That is the ache, to still be present, but not seen. Some women, of course, found freedom in this fading. No longer watched. They could move more freely, speak more boldly, visit gardens alone, sit with their thoughts unbothered. The pressure eased, the mask loosened, the gaze moved onto younger faces. There was relief in that. Others tried to hold the line. They mixed ointments, wore tighter veils, adjusted the light in their chambers. Recipes promised remedies: fig sap for wrinkles, ash for age spots, honey to preserve youth. Pilgrimage, too, was sometimes prescribed, not for beauty, but for meaning. If the world would not see them, perhaps God still would. The Church told women to look inward, to trade the fading flesh for eternal grace. But grace did not always quiet the longing. A widow might still touch the comb on her table and remember when her hair had drawn glances. A nun might remember a name once whispered with affection. Beauty had never been stable, not even in youth, but now in its absence. Many felt how deeply it had rooted itself in their sense of self. It was not vanity, it was survival, and without it they had to find something new, something within, and they did, in herbs and healing, in wisdom passed down to daughters, in weaving, in stories, in the rhythms of the seasons. They became watchers instead of the watched, the quiet keepers of memory, the fire behind the curtain. In the end, the medieval woman who aged was not a ruin. She was a lantern, dimmed perhaps, but still warm, still glowing. And if you stood in the candlelight long enough, truly stood there, you would see her, not as a failed beauty, but as something softer, stronger, still here, still whole.